What's going on, guys? This is Rob, and if you're enjoying the content here on my channel, then make sure you hit the like button and make sure you hit subscribe so you can help decide what direction the content on my channel goes in the foreseeable future. Okay, members of the Rob Corps, I gotta be straight up with you guys. I gotta be honest with you guys. I like Jane Foster Thor more than Odin's son. I'm just gonna say it. I think she is a better Thor than he was. I think she's more interesting. I think seeing the struggle, with her trying to figure out how to use the hammer. I think the idea that almost everybody in Asgard sees her as a thief and a liar because she's wielding a personal weapon used by Odin's son for the longest time. I think all of those things make her more interesting and intriguing than Odin's son. However, Unworthy Thor is probably the best Thor-based story that Jason Aaron has written so far. Granted, it is one giant epic. I mean, Unworthy Thor will just be considered, for the most part, a tie-in to what's going on with Thor, but it basically sees to us the return of Odin's son back to the main Marvel universe and presumably the role he's going to play going forward. But it is a beautifully crafted story. And the reason why is because it's Jason Aaron sitting down and saying, okay, look, a lot of you guys got on board with Thor with all different Marvel. So all you've known is Jane Foster Thor. Whereas he also says a lot of people out there really loved Odin's son. So let's give them the Odin's son they want. Let's give them the Odin's son they know and love. He won't have the hammer of Thor, but let's return to familiarity regarding his character and why people dig him so much. Now, again, we initially pick up with this in this little ship thing. And remember, we talked about this with Jane Foster, Thunder in Her Veins, the first story arc that she had as part of all new, all different Marvel. But all we really knew was that Odin's son was being held captive. And it was just like a 1 or 2 page final showing from Jason Aaron basically teasing the upcoming Unworthy Thor story, the story that we're going through right now. And of course, we know that Thor had been held captive by these guys. And that was kind of the cool thing here, is because what Jason Aaron does is he bases a lot of what it is that Thor's capable of on his hammer. And even with Thor himself, in terms of how he relates to what he can and can't do, very much what's going to be happening here is the hammer is going to basically be what makes Thor who he is. And that's going to be the funny thing about this, is because Jason Aaron's going to kind of play on this, right? Like, there are fans who say, no, Thor, Odin's son, is Thor, all right? Thor's not like a title, Thor is a name. Well, Jason Aaron say, no, I mean, I'm writing the book and the character's whatever I say he is because I'm writing him at the moment. It's Odin's son. Thor is a title. Captain America is a title. Iron Man is a title. Thor is a title. And it works out well. I mean, it all comes together pretty well in terms of, how the character functions and how he sees himself and the type of story that we get. But the fact remains here that it's constantly an attempt to free himself. And that's where Thor really kind of reflects on his role so far. He basically says, look, I'm a half measure. I don't have the hammer. I can't fly. I'm just a guy fighting as best I can. Now, keep in mind, just because Thor doesn't have the hammer doesn't mean that he's like a normal human being. I mean, the whole Thor, Blake, Donald Blake thing, that's long since been gone. That was really kind of cast off after Ragnarok. I mean, that was a holdover from really before Thor disassembled and the events leading up to Civil War, the first Civil War. But after Ragnarok, the Donald Blake Thor concept was basically kind of thrown out the window. It appeared here and there, but Jason Aaron has very much just kind of left that era of Thor's publication history behind. So what we have here is basically just a super strong, super durable Asgardian. Thor is really kind of who he is because he's the greatest warrior of the Asgardians. But Thor is not intrinsically better than any other Asgardian, with the exception of strength and speed and so on and so forth. But what we also get here is Thor basically attempting to capture the hammer of ultimate Thor. Now, we'll find out exactly what this hammer is capable of, but the cool thing about this is that, remember, during the Secret Wars story of Thors, where we basically had all these different Thors from across the multiverse that were operating as the police force of Battleworld under the rule of God King Doom, of Dr. Doom, that in this major battle, in this major conflict, Ultimate Thor's hammer had been thrown from the realm of Battleworld, had broken through reality and landed on Asgard in the main Marvel universe. And so because this, it had just been sitting there ever since. Now, in reality, this was basically Jason Aaron saying, okay, let's take this ultimate hammer of Thor and let's just set it aside for a second so we can come back to it later on. That's basically all he was doing there. But the ultimate hammer of Thor is different in terms of determining who can wield it and who can't than the main Marvel hammer of Thor. And we'll talk about that difference here in a second. But what we do is we actually jump back to 3 months prior to this point. And again, this is really Thor just kind of dealing with the fact that he does not have the ability to wield his hammer anymore. More so than that, this is also Thor dealing with the recollection or dealing with the realization that there is a new Thor. Remember, this comes after, Jane Foster had become Thor. Now, keep in mind, Odin's son does not know that Jane Foster's Thor. All he knows is the hammer chose
knows someone. There's only like 3 people. The number of people who know are extremely small. Odin's son is not one of them. In lieu of Jane Foster being Thor, Odin's son's just kind of doing what he can to be the warrior that he considered himself to be. And so it's really just kind of him showing up on the moon, fighting against some trolls, wearing them out. But it's also Jason Aaron sitting down and saying, everyone knows that Odin's son cannot wield his hammer anymore. Everybody knows that he's not Thor anymore, that a new person is Thor. And so there's a lot of taunting that goes on here. A lot of people saying like, you're a half measure. If you're not worthy of your own hammer, why should we worry about you? Now, of course, Thor proves his mettle in the sense that he still has Jarnbjorn. Now, keep in mind, Jarnbjorn was established to be a magically enchanted axe during the Uncanny Avengers one-off when Thor fought Apocalypse. That told us a story of why it is that Jarnbjorn is enchanted with magic that allows it to be extremely durable and cut through everything up to celestial armor. So it's still a formidable weapon, and Thor is still a very capable warrior. He just doesn't have all the attributes that come along with his hammer, so flight and different things like that. This is very much, him kind of dealing with where he stands in the realm of, not having his normal powers. Now, again, this also takes place during the War of the Nine Realms. So keep in mind, we still have Malekith, alongside Loki and these guys, basically trying to conquer all the different realms that are part of Asgard. And so because of that, it creates a really interesting situation because there's a lot of stuff going on in the background. Now, we've covered a lot of that stuff in All New, All Different Marvel. Of course, you'll find those videos down in the description, but we've covered a lot of that stuff. So you guys don't have to worry about feeling kind of left out. You can check out those videos and see what's going on in the background of all this. But again, this is Jason building up to the whisper of Nick Fury, what it was that Nick Fury said to Thor that made him unworthy. And so Thor kind of ponders this for a minute, but then he's visited by the unseen. And that's the cool thing because Jason Aaron really seems to be the only person, aside from Brian Michael Bendis at the moment anyway, they really seem to be the only 2 people who are referencing events from before Secret Wars. Everybody seems to be kind of focusing on the aftermath of Secret Wars, which is fine. I mean, it's kind of refreshing to get a little bit of both. There were a lot of things that took place before Secret Wars, a lot of unresolved plot points that I really would like to have seen answered. And this is one of them. For those of you guys who never saw my videos on Original Sin, during that story, it was basically revealed that Nick Fury killed the Watcher, the original Nick Fury, the white Nick Fury, basically, that he had killed the Watcher. In return, Nick Fury had basically become this inherent bad guy. We learned things like different iterations of Nick Fury that all the superheroes had seen on Earth. That was never the real Nick Fury. The real Nick Fury was just sitting on a satellite orbiting the planet Earth that nobody knew about because it had stealth technology and so on. And all the other Nick Furies that people were seeing were just life model decoys. And so because of this, at the end of the story, Nick Fury was basically kind of cast out. He was more or less killed, kind of, resurrected, but he was basically the new Watcher. He's what's called the Unseen, meaning he sees everything. Now, the reason why he's called the Unseen is because it fits perfectly into Marvel's stance right now that, not everybody's paying attention to it. And so whenever you're going through a story that takes place on the moon and you don't see Nick Fury there, it's like, well, he's the Unseen, that kind of thing. But the fact remains here that, again, this is Nick Fury basically saying, look, I've seen everything. I mean, I saw the collapse of the multiverse. I saw the rebirth of the multiverse. But in the time between those 2 events, I saw a hammer leave one reality and arrive in this reality. It's basically Nick Fury telling Odin's son, there's another hammer. There's another hammer out there for you to pick up. And so what this does is it basically leads into the idea that we're going to see Odin's son wielding the hammer of Ultimate Thor. And that is amazing because Ultimate Thor was so cool. One of the coolest things that Marvel did, to kind of sidetrack here for a second, one of the coolest things that Marvel did in the Ultimate Universe when it came to Thor is they danced around the idea in the early days of whether or not he was actually Thor. Maybe he was just a crazy guy. Maybe it was just he was being possessed or something like that. Because remember, the Ultimate Universe was designed to be very realistic. There were stories that weren't that great. There were stories that were just kind of like, all right, this is ridiculous. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver were a perfect example. But, there were also some great moments too. And Ultimate Thor was pretty solid. But what we also end up doing is we basically pick up with Thor arriving in Asgard. Now, this has been a big source of contention, and the reason why is because it's confused a lot of people. So here's how things went. With regards to the Thor landscape, Asgard is both a specific place that you can stand on, like an actual landmass, and it's a realm at the same time. So think about it like New York, right? Like you have New York State and you have New York City. New York State is like the realm of Asgard. New York City is Asgard itself. So it's both a place and an actual geographical location at the same time. But old Asgard has essentially just vanished and nobody knows where it went to. No one has any idea. Not only that, Odin's son is visited by Beta Ray Bill. And that's why this is such a great story, is because it's Jason Aaron hitting all the marks of classic Thor storytelling, classic Thor publications. Now, those of you guys who don't know, Thor fans will swear by Beta Ray Bill. It's the one character they want to see in a Thor story. There are some Thor fans out there, and I don't know why anybody would want to see this, but there are some Thor fans out there who would rather see Beta Ray Bill than the Incredible Hulk and Thor Ragnarok. Now, I want to see the Incredible Hulk and Thor Ragnarok because Thor Ragnarok's basically going to be Planet Hulk with Thor. But it's going to be a cool story. But Beta Ray Bill was basically the first person in Marvel Comics to wield the hammer of Thor. And that's why he's so significant. He was the first person to pick it up. Now, of course, Beta Ray Bill was basically a warrior guardian of his race called the Corbinites, and they were basically on the brink of extinction. They were literally leaving their home and trying to find a new one. And so when Thor first encountered Beta Ray Bill after being told by Nick Fury, there's some vessel entering our atmosphere, go check it out and see what's going on. Beta Ray Bill and Thor fought, not because Beta Ray Bill was a bad guy, but because he was trying to protect his people. And so because of that, he was inherently a good guy fighting for the right reasons, and that worthiness allowed him to pick up the hammer of Thor. Ever since then, Beta Ray Bill has had the saga of Beta Ray Bill, a 6-issue miniseries, so on and so forth, but he's always been an intrinsic part of Thor's landscape. But what Beta Ray Bill does is he offers Thor his hammer called Stormbreaker. Now, because of the fact that Beta Ray Bill was a worthy candidate for the hammer of Thor when they first met, what Odin did is have the two of them fight over the worthiness of who is allowed to wield the hammer of Thor. Now, of course, in return, once it was all said and done, once the battle was finished, Odin's son had Beta Ray Bill, given a hammer, had a hammer forged for him that was basically called Stormbreaker. And so in a lot of ways, Stormbreaker is much like Thor's hammer. But Thor's, his hammer is a little special, it's kind of something that's unique to himself, but the two of them are basically teaming up here. And the reason why is because Beta Ray Bill says, look, I know who it was that took Asgard. We have to go and we have to find them. Now, of course, once they locate where Asgard is, we actually end up finding out that it was the Collector. It was Tannelir Tavan that took Asgard. Now, the reason why is because of the fact that basically the hammer of Ultimate Thor landed on Asgard, and only a person who can wield the hammer can pick it up. And so it's a cool question that's going to be asked here in a second. But in the midst of their journey, so on and so forth, again, Thor is constantly succumbing to these dreams. He's constantly having these nightmares, whenever he's knocked out or something along those lines. And the nightmare he experiences comes at the hands of Gore the God Butcher. Now, God Butcher was a story that basically dealt with a guy named Gore who had come to the belief that gods, people who fancied themselves gods, were basically guilty of hubris. They were guilty of extreme arrogance. And so because of that, Gore basically went on this campaign to kill every single god he could find. Now, Gore is going to be a recurring theme in this story. But of course, Thor is basically being held here by Tannelir Tavan, by the Collector. And the reason why is because the Collector says, I can't lift the hammer of Thor off the old city of Asgard, so I took the old city of Asgard, which of course kind of answers the question, if Thor is wielding his hammer, can somebody pick up Thor? This is also Thor coming to the realization that there is another hammer to be used here. Now, of course, this is also the Collector being pretty evil here. Now, keep in mind, when it comes to the Elders of the Universe, they're basically the last of their races. I mean, they've existed for billions and billions of years, but they're also wildly powerful. The Collector is extremely powerful, energy projection, super strength, durability, but despite all his vaunted abilities, he cannot lift the hammer. And the reason why is because with Ultimate Thor, anybody who tries to lift the hammer and is unworthy dies. They're basically killed by the hammer. And that's the difference. With the main Marvel Universe Thor, if you were to go and try to pick up his hammer, it just wouldn't lift. I mean, you just wouldn't be able to lift it. In the Ultimate Universe, it'll kill you. So you better choose wisely. But it's kind of a cool story. It's kind of a cool set of circumstances. But that's what Collector says. Now, of course, the Collector, being as powerful as he is, tried to pick up the hammer. He was administered the same kind of damaging shock, as anybody else who tried to pick it up. But because of his durability, he just wasn't killed. He basically said it was just a crushing experience. But again, he basically kind of torments and tortures Thor by way of threatening to kill the last of a race of people. Because remember, the Collector basically collects trinkets, things, the last of something. If there's the last member of a race, and there will never be any other members of that race in the universe, the Collector will try to collect them. Because of this, the Collector's question is basically, how do I lift that hammer? There has to be a way to pick it up, because what happens is the Collector basically says, look, if I can wield this hammer, then I'll be all powerful. I can conquer worlds. I'll be virtually unstoppable. And that's true. If a normal person, if a regular human being like Jane Foster were to pick it up, it would make her capable. It would make her as powerful as Thor. If someone like Thanos or someone like the Collector were to pick it up, it would make them nigh unstoppable. Now, that's really the goal of the Collector, is to capture the hammer of Thor, to use it for his own ends. Now, at this point, we pick up with the Triskelion. Now, this story basically kind of stretches over a period of time. And so what it does is it basically takes place before the events of Civil War II, during the events of Civil War II, and after the events of Civil War II. The great thing about this is that with the exception of Thanos, there are no other references to Civil War II, so we don't have to worry about the greatness of the story being drugged down by Civil War II being as bad as it was. But, what we basically do is we have somebody who's cloaked visiting Thanos, because remember, when Ulysses of the Inhumans was basically looking into the future and saw that Thanos was going to arrive here, after the death of James Rhodes, Thanos was basically taken prisoner and held inside the Triskelion. The problem here is that we don't know who this person is that's visiting Thanos, and we won't find out until the end of the story. But again, we kind of switch back to the modern day, to this moment right now, and this is really kind of Jason Aaron just building up the roster of Thor characters, in the sense of saying, hey, look, you've got like Thor, which is basically a hellhound. For those of you guys who don't know, know, Hellhound is just basically one of the many things that exists inside the realm of hell. But what had happened is that Hellhound had basically engineered his escape during the events of Angela, Queen of Hell. Now, there's a lot of small things that are being hit here over the course of this. And so what we're going to do, at least what I plan to do, is basically, run over the Thor stories the same way I did the Incredible Hulk. And we'll probably do that once we get closer to the release of Thor Ragnarok, because what I'll do is the actual Ragnarok story, and then we'll pick up with J. Michael Straczynski's Thor when Odin's son came back to life, and all the publications that went through after that, eventually getting into Jason Aaron's run up to the modern day. It'll take us a little while to do, but I think we're going to do that the same way we did with the Incredible Hulk. I don't think it'll be as long as the Incredible Hulk playlist, but that's something that I'd kind of planned on doing. But again, it's constantly Thor trying to break his way out. It's constantly Thor trying to make his escape. Now again, Beta Ray Bill eventually comes back to his rescue, because remember, once Thor had realized that the Collector had stolen old Asgard, Thor just kind of raced off without Beta Ray Bill. Now, with regards to his goat Tooth Gnasher, he was captured, Odin's son was captured, and he's just been held ever since. But with Beta Ray Bill arriving to free Thor, this is where we begin to see Jason Aaron kind of tapping into how Thor views his hammer. Instead of Thor looking at his hammer and saying, here is an object that can help me achieve my goals, Thor is addicted to his hammer. Thor needs his hammer. It's very much a drug for him. And the reason we know this is because of the fact that when Beta Ray Bill shows up, this is the first time Thor has seen him in quite some time. Remember, we had that kind of 3-month jump. So Thor was basically captured by the Collector. He's been held for the last 3 months, and now he's seeing Beta Ray Bill again. And so because of that, as soon as he sees Beta Ray Bill, his mind snaps back to the first time that he and Beta Ray Bill first met, when Bill took the hammer of Thor and said, the hammer is now mine. Odin's son freaks out and goes into the warrior's madness. So let me tell you something, Rockford. The warrior's madness is a sight to behold. It's one of the coolest things. Basically what happens here is Thor, it's like Berserker Hulk, right? Like Thor does not care what happens. Thor's like, anybody who's in my path is going to die. I don't care who they are. He'll have his heart set on a goal. He'll be like, I'm trying to get from A to B. Everybody is in my way between A and B. So he'll snap into the warrior's madness. He'll kill everybody in his path and then get to B. Not only that, when this cloaked figure had basically traveled to Thanos and asked for his aid, what we end up finding out is that his aid comes in the form of Proxima Midnight and Black Swan. Now, it is no mistake that these two characters are in this story. And the reason why is because they're going to be in Thor Ragnarok. At least I know Proxima Midnight's going to be in there, as well as Corvus Glaive. I don't know if Black Swan is going to be in there. I think she is. But again, Black Swan is kind of a holdover from Jonathan Hickman's events of Time Runs Out, New Avengers and Avengers. And that's a long series. That's a whole long story about her that we're not going to get into. Suffice it to say, she basically joined Thanos' cabal when they were going through and destroying Earths during the incursions. So she had kind of allied herself to inherently being a bad guy. Now, with regards to Proxima Midnight, she was part of Thanos' cabal during the events of Infinity. And so she's been around for quite a while too. But the idea is that they're basically part of something called the Black Order, this group of individuals that follows Thanos. Now, there's a few other people here and there, but they're really kind of like the top ones. Again, we still don't know who this cloaked figure is, but basically what's happening is everybody is trying to track down this hammer. Everybody's trying to find this hammer of Ultimate Thor. And it's such a cool thing to see. And the reason why is because of the fact that when this cloaked figure tracks down Odin's son, all she finds is Odin's son with Yarnbjorn, his battle axe, and Beta Ray Bill with Stormbreaker, where her initial response is, this is Stormbreaker. It's nowhere near the level of the hammer that we're looking for. I've basically led us on a wild goose chase. We have to regain our bearings and head to where we actually need to go. But in the moment when they're teleporting away, this is when Beta Ray Bill basically recognizes the power that's being used here. Now, in truth, just because of the colors that are being used, just because of the colors of the person, we know that this is basically Hela. That's really who this is, or at least that's who it seems to be, that it's basically Hela, the woman who previously ruled Hell, and it's since been cast out, which is kind of cool because Jason Aaron isn't really kind of sending her off to no man's land. He's keeping her in a role that still has some measure of use. Now, of course, following this, we actually have Proxima Midnight and we have Black Swan and we have this cloaked figure showing up where the Collector is and basically trying to take the hammer for their own. Now, the cool thing about this is that this cloaked person, again, presuming that it's Hela, basically says, look, when Proxima Midnight and Black Swan try to go after the Collector and take the hammer, this cloaked figure says, you guys are running a fool's errand. The Elders of the Universe are extremely powerful. They're beyond us. And so if you want to go and attack one and try to take the hammer, have at it. Do your best. But in the midst of this battle, the hammer suddenly basically explodes with energy, which is an indication to basically all who are there that Odin's son is coming for the hammer. And that's the coolest thing about this, is because we get this really cool moment here. We get this really cool page. We basically see Thor and we see Tooth Gnasher and we have Odin's son and we have Beta Ray Bill, and Odin's son says, look, I don't care what it is that I have to do. I don't care if I have to cut through 1,000 men. I don't care if I have to wade through a river river of blood, but by God, that hammer will be mine. Come hell or high water, I will wield that hammer before the day is out. And so from here, we basically transition over to, again, this current battle that's taking place, where we started at the beginning of the story, which is where you basically have Odin's son and you have these different guys, Odin's son and Beta Ray Bill, facing off against the forces of the Collector. And it's kind of cool to see because everybody's bidding for the hammer. With each breath they take, in each instance where they're kind of free from the battle for a second, when they have their enemy distracted, they all try to make a run for the hammer, but no one really seems to have the ability to grab it like they need to. No one has the ability to actually harness it because somebody grabs them, stops them from pulling it off, stops them from being able to harness it. Now, at this point, we switch over to really several years before any of this happened, back when Jane Foster and Thor were still very much in a relationship. Now keep in mind, with regards to their publication history, before Jane Foster had contracted cancer and before she became Thor, she and Odin's son were lovers. And there was a point where she would spend a lot of time on Asgard. I mean, it was really kind of one of those things where Odin was like, I guess you could, but I always hoped you'd get with Sif. The fact remains here that with the two of them being together, that what happens is they basically sit down and Thor, Odin's son, tells Jane Foster how he views the hammer. And that's the coolest thing about this, because this is basically Jason Aaron saying, here is the real reason why it is that Thor can't wield his hammer. What Nick Fury said was the catalyst, and we'll find out what Nick Fury said, but what Nick Fury said was the catalyst. The real reason why Thor can't wield his hammer is because of self-doubt. What Odin's son says is that in his mind, he's terrified of his hammer. He's afraid of his hammer. The reason being is because he doesn't know every time, whenever it is that he wakes up, that he'll be able to lift the hammer. His biggest fear is that every morning, he'll wake up, whatever morning he happens to wake up on, he'll go to reach for his hammer and he won't be able to lift it. And what this does is it basically shows that Odin's son does not view the hammer as an extension of himself, because you usually, normal people don't wake up in the morning and say, man, I'm really terrified that I won't be able to move my arm. That's not a normal thought that you have. But with Odin's son looking at his hammer, he doesn't see it as an extension of himself. He sees it as an object. He sees it as a tool. Now, it very much is, but he has to view it as an extension of himself. Not only that, he doesn't see himself as inherently worthy. And that's the difference. Jane Foster says, you are. You'll always be worthy. You're the greatest warrior I've ever known. You're tried, you're true, you do the right thing to the best of your ability, is her reassuring him. But Odin's son doesn't hear it. He says, I enjoy your words, I'm glad you're telling me these things, it makes me feel great, but I still do not believe that I'm, inherently worthy of this hammer. I didn't choose the hammer chose me. And that's the difference here, is because with Jane Foster Thor, the hammer did initially choose her, but she doesn't see the hammer as a tool. She sees the hammer as an extension of herself. The hammer is something that helps her to achieve her goal. That's how Jane Foster sees it. She sees it as basically an ally, as a friend, whereas Odin's son saw it as just an object to be used. And that's what makes it so cool. That's basically kind of Jason Aaron saying, this is the reason why he can't lift it. It's not because he's not inherently worthy. He is worthy. It's just the hammer doesn't want him to lift it anymore, because it's all about how Thor views himself. Now, in terms of what sent him down this rabbit hole of actually being unworthy in the eyes of the hammer, again, we'll get to that here in a second. But what we end up doing is we basically have, Odin's son getting to this hammer at the last second, only to be intervened by Tannelir Tavan, only to be intervened by the Collector. Now, of course, they grab, Thor, they kind of grab Odin's son, they kind of pull him back. But then we flash back to, around 9 months ago, after it was that Odin's son was no longer able to wield his own hammer. And that's what makes this scene so ironic, is because Jane Foster visits him, she's wielding the hammer, but she can't bring herself to tell Odin's son that she's the one who can wield it. Now, the reason why she can't bring herself to tell him is for a couple reasons. The first is because of the fact that in the early days of her becoming Thor, she felt like she had basically stolen something from Odin's son. Because the two of them had been so close, and even after they split, even after she had gotten remarried, even after she'd gotten divorced, even after she had contracted cancer, she still loved Thor. And she felt like if she had his hammer, if she was running around wielding it, that it would basically be a betrayal of everything they've had. So she couldn't bring herself to say that. In addition to that, she was dealing with enough as it is with regards to Odin basically saying, you're a false Thor, you're no longer welcome in Asgard. But because Odin couldn't even lift the hammer, he couldn't take it from her. Otherwise, he would have taken it from her quite some time ago. And so again, this is crushing for Jane Foster, because she has to look at Odin's son for what he is and see that the reason why he couldn't lift his hammer was because he never saw himself as somebody who was intrinsically worthy. In his mind, he was just a guy who happened to be able to use it for some period of time, and the hammer simply found someone better. Now, as this battle progresses on old Asgard, we basically have Odin's son coming out on top, not necessarily killing everybody, but coming out on top and being able to basically harness the hammer. Now, in the moment which he goes to pick it up, what Jason Aaron does is he switches over to the unseen, to Nick Fury. And Nick Fury is watching this whole event unfold. He's seeing everything happening. He doesn't tell us what it was that he said to Thor, but he sees everything happening and he says, yes, Odin's son, this is your future. Pick up this hammer. This is who you are destined to be. Jason Aaron almost gives us that. And as I was reading through the story, I was like, no, I was so mad because Odin's son is just like, I feel this hammer. I feel the power radiating in this hammer. It hasn't killed me yet. The hammer sees me as someone worthy of picking it up, someone who could lift it. He says, look, I am Thor. I am the mighty Thor. I am the god of thunder. I am Thor, whether I'm wielding the hammer or not. But he says, this is not my hammer. My hammer is Mjolnir. I am going to take my hammer back, or at least it seems to be the indication that Odin's son intends to regain his hammer again to prove his worthiness. Now, of course, in this scene, he basically walks away from the hammer. He leaves the hammer behind. Now, he's still kind of radiating with a bit of the energy that he gained from the hammer while he touched it, but the fact remains that he basically leaves it behind. At the same time, he has Thor free all these different captives that have been held by the Collector, and then he frees old Asgard and returns the landmass of Asgard back to the realm of Asgard. And so it's basically Jason Aaron kind of setting the stage and saying, we're going to essentially, bring things into full fruition. Now, if I had to hazard a guess, what I'm thinking is that whether or not Thor gets his own hammer back is something that we don't know. But I think Thor will eventually become king of Asgard, that we will see things begin to progress to the point of what we saw at the third act of God Butcher, when you have future Thor. You have old Thor that's ruling over Asgard, and there are no more Asgardians. You just kind of have this irradiated earth. The earth is basically barren, all life is gone, that kind of thing. It was a very bleak future, but at this point, we switch back over to the Black Quadrant, back to where Thanos is. Remember, Thanos has basically already escaped during the events leading up to and during Civil War II. But when the Black Order shows up and says, hey, look, we promised you this object. We promised you this hammer. We'll do whatever we need to do in order to find it. Thanos' response is, look, if Thor's not even worthy enough to wield his own hammer, why is he worthy enough of my attention? I've got other things to worry about. I've got more important things to worry about than an Asgardian that can't even do something as simple as lift his own hammer. Now, this is cool because this is basically Thanos being Thanos. And that's what I loved about this story, is because Jason Aaron writes Thanos so well. He does an amazing job with his character. Thanos says, look, here's the goal that I want to achieve. If that goal can't be achieved, then Thanos is like, whatever, I've got other things that I can be doing. And he just moves on to another goal. Because of that, Thanos basically says, look, the idea was that this cloaked figure showing up on his doorstep basically said, if you get, if you will help me, I will get you the hammer of Thor. This person failed to show up with the hammer of Thor. What this cloaked figure does is they basically kill Proxima Midnight. Now, with Proxima Midnight being killed, with Proxima Midnight basically being totally obliterated, with Black Swan looking to be completely killed, what ends up happening here is this person reveals herself to, again, be Hela, the former ruler of Hell. And what Hela says is, look, I can give you the one thing that you desire. I can give you the one thing you want most, more than the Infinity Gauntlet, more than the Cosmic Cube. When Thanos asks what that is, Hela says, I can give you death. And so what this is basically Jason Aaron sitting around and saying, this is very much still a part of the Thanos mythos, his love for death. Not only that, I would also say that this seems to be an indication that in the Marvel Cinematic Universe, we probably won't actually see Mistress Death so much as we'll actually see Hela playing the role of Mistress Death. Now, we may see Mistress Death somewhere along the line, and we may actually see her. I'm just kind of guessing at this point, but it sort of makes sense that Hela, if she basically represents death, that if the Marvel Cinematic Universe turned around and brought in the actual cosmic entity Mistress Death, it would confuse people, because you've got the Mistress entity Death, and then you've got Hela who represents death. Which one is actually death? It would throw off your casual audience. But what ends up happening is that with old Asgard being restored, Beta Ray Bill and Thor sit down and kind of have this conversation, and Beta Ray Bill asks him the question, could you have actually lifted that hammer if you tried to? And Odin's son says, it doesn't matter. It's not relevant. It's not my hammer to wield. And so then we have Beta Ray Bill asking the question, do you believe that you are a worthy individual? And Odin's son says, no one is worthy. And when Beta Ray Bill asks him, why would you say that? This is when we get what it is that Nick Fury said to Thor. What Nick Fury said was, Gore was right. And what this did is it sent Thor into self-doubt. It sent Odin's son into self-doubt. Now, this is one of those situations where, because of the fact that it's taken so long for us to get an answer, no answer you get would be good enough. So I imagine there's some people who are just going to be like, well, that answer's stupid. Well, any answer you got would be stupid. I mean, let's be honest here, guys. Like, any answer you got, you would think was stupid. There would not be a good enough answer. It's just how these kind of things go. But it fits in perfectly with the Jason Aaron Thor mythos, because what this does is it circles right back around to the very beginning with God Butcher. And very few writers do this. Very few writers will basically have a story, have this great big huge epic that will stretch on for 20 volumes, and then near the end wrap back around to the very beginning. They'll just say, here's A, and then here's B, and then here's D, and then here's C. Here's just a linear set of events, and then it'll end with the person dying or something like that. That's classic storytelling. The reason why Jason Aaron stands out is because it's not classic storytelling. It's wrapping it around into one great big huge epic. And that's why I say, when this is all said and done, whether or not you love Jane Foster, whether or not you love Odin's Son, when Jason Aaron puts down the pen and says, and now we are finished writing, people are going to look back at his run of Thor and say, it's the greatest run there's ever been. It is the greatest Thor run that has ever existed. And as far as I'm concerned, it is. But the cool thing about this is that with Nick Fury telling Thor, Gore was right, what this does is it basically sends Thor into self-doubt, because Thor comes to believe that Gore was right, that humanity was better off without gods, that gods are arrogant, that gods are not worth the trust that humanity puts in them. It creates kind of a cool situation here, but yeah, what this story kind of does is it basically shows us that the hammer of Thor, the hammer of Ultimate Thor, is picked up by somebody. We don't know who this person is, but the hammer of Thor is picked up by someone. And so because of that, this person basically dons the mantle of War Thor. Now what this means for them, we don't know. But if you are new here to Comics Explained, make sure you hit the sub button to become part of the Rob Corps. If you guys enjoy this video, make sure you drop a like, and yeah, I will catch you all later. Peace.